Hello, and welcome to Good News Rhode Island, the show about Rhode Island and the people and places and events that make it a great place to live. If you have someone in your neighborhood who you'd like us to interview, or if you have some event coming up, let us know at goodnewsri@gmail.com. Today we have a very special guest whose name is Abbott Gleason. He's been teaching Russian history and history at Brown University, recently retired, and the first thing he did was to write his memoirs, or his autobiography, called A Liberal Education. And he's coming from many different viewpoints over the decades as history has changed and changed him, and he has changed, I'm sure, the lives of students. Recently he had a book signing, and the line was out the door, and so we are very happy to have him here, and glad that you will be with us to answer some questions about your memoir, A Liberal Education.
It will be a pleasure, I'm sure.
This is a really inclusive and honest memoir. It's breezy and fun, but it's also very deep and penetrating. It's reminiscent of events that have formed us all, but then a lot of your own personal history and the lives and the people that have been part of your life. You seem to be able to put them into perspective and see yourself as you developed, which is developed and changed. It's really interesting to read. I can't imagine that people who aren't interested in childhood development, for example, or in moral development wouldn't be interested in reading it. So congratulations on a very readable book.
Well, that's something that every author likes to hear, I'm sure, and I especially enjoy hearing it from you.
Thank you. Let me ask you, you retired and then I saw you walking down the street with this in the finished form. How long did it take you to write it?
Well, I wrote it in fits and starts, and I'm tempted to say more fits than starts. I wrote the first piece of it, chunk of it, in 1979, and it was published in a now defunct journal called Country Journal, Blair and Ketchum's Country Journal. And then I really got started doing the thing as a project in the late 1980s, when I was actually, for the first time, all by myself in an apartment that I'd rented in Leningrad.
So you had a lot of reflective time, I guess, there.
I did.
Okay. And can you talk, I'm going to start sort of in the beginning and work through. As you remember your earliest memories, how do you think they are affecting you today? I think you have that ability to make that kind of juxtaposition that some people don't have.
Well, everybody gives their interpretation of their early days, and I think my interpretation is dominated by the idea, which I got from my family as well as from later reflection, that I was quite a tough kid to bring up, that I was a mean little kid, as Red Skelton once put it, or used to put it on the radio.
So do you think you're hard on yourself?
Well, I don't think so, actually. But when a book like this demands that you interpret yourself, and there probably is some tendency for people who do that to maybe to overinterpret themselves, to give themselves a consistency that they didn't actually have. So my focus on being a nasty little boy may have led me to overemphasize the nasty part.
I was wondering about all of the influences that you had of people who were making big decisions, who were very influential in society. I wonder if some of that didn't change your behavior yourself as a child.
Well, I think I grew up as a sort of minor member of what we later learned to call the establishment in Washington, but I don't think I had delusions of grandeur.
No, but I think that kind of seeing people who are so powerful makes a child want to feel inadequate and want to do something that will get them noticed.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think I did want to be noticed, and the best way to get noticed that I first stumbled upon was to do something destructive or interrupt somebody or jump in front of the camera myself, sort of a baby Henry Kissinger style, getting attention.
Okay, as you grew, you changed schools enough, and each school had a very, very definite influence on you. I very much enjoyed reading about your middle school years and your high school years. Maybe you could talk some about that.
Well, my kids were amazed when I got out one day. I had been, just before I retired, I was trying to put some papers in order, and I found my report cards from the two schools that I went to, one in Cambridge and one in Washington, D.C., Brown and Nichols, as it then was, in St. Albans. And my kids were stupefied to see how badly behaved I'd been. And so I think I was influenced by that, and I said, I've got to get these report cards in. And I think probably because I had really good documentation for being a bad kid. Historians use what they have, and you're at the mercy of your sources. And if your sources reflect one aspect of the situation, you're likely to use it. So I think maybe I wasn't quite such a little snot as my sources portrayed me.
I loved reading about the influence of jazz on your life, and as you developed, and you're learning about music and your friends who were so musical.
Yeah, well, I think really I've only had one, what a writer like Joyce or somebody would call an epiphany. And it was the first time that I ever heard an old-fashioned New Orleans jazz front line, trumpet, trombone, and clarinet. And all of a sudden, all the other sort of big band stuff and popular music, all of it sort of fell away. And I thought, man, this is it. This is what I want to hear. And I can still recall the sensation that I had that somehow this took me deep into the way things really were. It was like seeing inside of something or seeing down into something. And I'd never had that experience before, and in a certain sense, I've never really had it since.
You also, at that time, had a sense of your own protectedness as a child, and you were encountering racism for the first time through jazz. Is that true, or?
Oh, yeah. My parents were in everything having to do with race were extremely liberal-minded, and also, as you say, very protective. So I had no idea that people got called names because they were black, or because they were Jewish, or because they were something else, or because they didn't look like you, or they even that they wore the wrong kind of clothes.
And you made friends with everyone, it seems to me, and you let everyone influence your way of understanding the world.
Well, I don't think I made friends with everybody. Again, I was too pugnacious and too confrontational to make friends with everybody.
You talked about one person who knocked you down with 2 punches once, and then you became very close friends.
Yes, that was a relatively late case. He was a very tough kid. He was the best, certainly the best white drummer in Washington, D.C. in the mid-1950s. And he was such a good drummer that he could go anywhere, and he could go into the black world, the world of black clubs and theaters, and did. And after we became friends, I went with him a great deal and loved doing that. But it was very unusual for white kids to go to those places.
And classical music has also had an influence.
Yes, I always liked classical music, but I never really knew a tremendous amount about it. I sang in choirs as a little boy. I was quite a good soprano, but nothing amazing. And as a tenor, I was definitely run-of-the-mill. But by sheer chance, I roomed with a real musical genius in college, a very well-known composer today named John Harbison. And that was also a tremendous influence on me.
And still is.
And still is, I would
imagine.
say.
I would imagine. And your friendships got you to meet other people as well who were Jewish, who had feelings about, obviously, had experiences of World War II, and you gradually shared with us your understandings as they changed and the danger.
We were talking about being protected. I was so protected that I really had, I was the complete product of a kind of genteel Episcopalian world. And I did, in fact, actually know a couple of Jews, but I didn't know that they were Jews, or I didn't understand that being Jewish was anything at all, anything of significance. And I knew very few Catholics and had no sense that Catholics and Protestants were different. I went mostly to private schools. So I was completely innocent of all of the diverse forces that were actually creating the social world in which I grew up. And I waltzed along in my little Protestant cocoon, going to church schools and thinking that that was all there was.
And suddenly at Harvard.
And suddenly it really happened. Well, it happened first at prep school in Washington at St. Albans, when I discovered black music. But I really discovered, it seems almost stupid to put it this way, but to speak of discovering Jews. I had a Jewish roommate, and I came back from lunch one day, and he was sitting pensively on his bunk bed. And I said, "What's the matter, Andy?" And he said, "I'm thinking about what it's like to be Jewish." The remark struck me as absurd. I said, "What do you mean? I don't sit around thinking about what it's like to be Christian." And he said, "Oh, but that's not the same thing." But I thought it was. So basically, I had, I really would say, the first conversation about difference that really was serious. And Harvard, questions of Jews and Gentiles were relatively prominent at Harvard in the late 1950s, and I drank deeply from that well.
And you had some very influential professors while you were there.
Yes. Let me speak of one in particular, perhaps, James Billington, who is still now our current Librarian of Congress, was one of the people who got me interested in Russia. And he was a very handsome and charismatic and melodramatic kind of teacher who gave me to understand that Russia was a very secret, exciting place. To be sure, the Russians were our enemies, but they were very, very interesting enemies. And he brought Russian literature and Russian music into Russian history, and that had a powerful effect on me.
So you became a Russian scholar possibly because of one professor, or the material really.
He played a very, people play a very key role in leading you places, but the way they say about a horse, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. Mm-hmm. You can have professors who introduce you to things, but if you're not ready to be introduced to them, it doesn't mean all that much. I had grown up in Washington during the early stages of the Cold War, and I think I was prepared by that to find Russia interesting. And also I was a lover of novels and fiction, and I think I was in various ways well set up to experience Russian literature very vividly. And both things happened.
So at the time, the buzz everywhere was about Russia and the Cold War.
Yes, very much so.
And so you sort of jumped in at the peak of Russian-U.S. tensions and began to study.
Yes, and for example, my father was on the National Security Council throughout the entire period of the Eisenhower-Nixon presidency. In fact, he was appointed to it under Truman. But I can remember being on Cape Cod when the Korean War broke out. And my parents were sitting out in the side yard, probably having a drink in late afternoon. And I heard on the radio inside that something had happened in Korea. And I came out to tell my parents because it sounded important. And in fact, I misinformed my father slightly. I said, the Russians have invaded South Korea. And of course, if that had actually happened, it would have, one cannot even imagine what the consequences would have been. It was bad enough as it was. But my father jumped up and ran into the house to find out. And basically, when he discovered that the North Koreans had invaded the South, we were in the car within hours and heading back to Washington. So I knew that Russian-American encounters and adventures were important.
Do you think you drew on information that you learned as a child of someone who was in the Security Council?
You know, I don't think it was so much the information as it was the atmosphere.
That makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense. So before we leave your schooling, one of the things we always talk about on this show is how schools and colleges influence the eventual adult person and how they are. What would you say to a student who was thinking about history as a major and schooling and the importance of choosing particular schools?
Well, I think theoretically at least, studying history is quite separable from what school you choose. There are a great many good historians around, and there are quite a lot of good universities around. And I think the two are not, in other words, what I'm trying to say is that I don't think the fact that I went to Harvard means that you can't become very interested in history and become a good historian and get good historical training at any number of places. I think you can. I was influenced in other ways, I think, by Harvard. Ultimately, I think it had a negative influence on me in certain respects. I didn't feel that the Harvard faculty, especially the senior faculty, taught very much or very actively. I thought there was a great deal of self-importance about Harvard. At the same time, I had a very wonderful cohort of people. So my experience at Harvard was mixed. I think there are all sorts of places where you can go and get historical training. One thing I should add quickly is that there aren't very many jobs in history out there, so I would not recommend in any kind of a general way that people interested in history go on, get a PhD, and think to teach. The jobs have been decreasing in number for some time, especially in the Russian field.
That's very interesting. One of the things that educates all of us is our environment, our context, and the context of the civil rights movement was very, very important to you, to all of us, I would think, who lived through the 60s. I wonder if you said you had something to read about Harvard Square and first encountering protest.
Oh, yes. I was, in my senior year at Harvard, I was one of the two captains, quote unquote, of the team that picketed Woolworths and trying to persuade them to desegregate their stores in the South. Of course, their stores were not segregated in Harvard Square. And my partner is currently I believe also now retired professor of philosophy at Harvard. And he was a graduate student then, and I was an undergraduate. And we had to organize the picketers at the 5 and 10 cent store in Harvard Square. And we had a lot of people eager to picket, many of them older people. There were a lot of liberals and even a few old-line communists around Boston in those days, and some of them were quite eager to get going, working on racism in the American South. So maybe shall I read just a little piece of what that was like?
Yes, thank you.
Charles Parsons and I, that's the philosophy professor, knew each other from Eliot House, where we both lived. We had our work cut out for us in organizing the picket lines, the first most of us had ever participated in. Our student colleagues were in general not a problem, but the possibility of making a contribution to civil rights without straying farther afield than Harvard Square attracted a number of local people from what we might call the old left. These stalwarts could be difficult. Professor and Mrs. Dirk Struick were a case in point. Struick was a distinguished specialist on early American science who taught at MIT. He and his wife were both militant Marxists, and it galled them when well-dressed Cambridge matrons crossed our picket line to pick up some item or other in Woolworths. Mrs. Struick in particular sometimes lost her cool and directed ominous, ideologically charged speeches at picket line crossers. Then fiery rhetoric about the imminent coming of revolution showed signs of getting out of hand. Eventually, Charles and I, tried framing our objections to her speeches in communist slogans that we imagined might have a favorable impact on her. No, Mrs. Struick, this is the popular front from above now. She was generally apologetic afterwards, and the whole picketing business was so exotic and peculiar at this early day that it may have hardly mattered what the picketers were shouting at passers-by. Most people had no idea of what to make of us, and we felt strange and awkward at being on a picket line at all.
Really interesting beginnings of movement now that we think is just natural to our American process. It's very interesting. Why aren't we doing this now?
Well, now you're asking a tough question. I think perhaps we are, in fact, beginning to do so. I've noticed that politics is becoming a little more interesting and a little more disturbing to students this year, it seems to me. And I noticed some conflict on a number of campuses over what seems to some people to be all-out American support for the right-wing Israeli government. I think there's some political action around that here and at Harvard and Columbia and other places. So I think I certainly don't think the 60s are going to come again. Somebody once said you never step into the same river twice. But I do think we may see a little bit more student political activity in the next few months.
Maybe jobs and healthcare and the two wars.
Yes.
Can you talk about Gorbachev and Russian history? We are moving quickly through your life, but we're also moving quickly through the half hour that we have. And I think Gorbachev was a very favorable character to most of us. A character meaning that he had edges, he had a personality that we seem to imagine anyway.
Yes, and interestingly enough, and I think this is an important part of it, he had the first, what I would call, companionate marriage that any Soviet leader had ever had. That is to say, Raisa Gorbacheva was a real figure in his life. She had an influence on him. She had an influence on what he did. She was a very intelligent and, as a young woman, extraordinarily beautiful woman. Gorbachev was a villain to many of his countrymen. He lost the empire, quote unquote. Obviously, he himself did not lose the empire, but he could be seen to have done so. But I think the rest of the world owes him an enormous debt because I think if people imagined that the Soviet Union was going to disappear rapidly at the turn of the 1990s, they imagined that many lives would be forfeit. And people even thought that it might happen in some major war scenario. And the fact that it happened with a very, very small number of fatalities is something that I do think we owe to Gorbachev, however bumbling he may have appeared to Russians.
And now our relationship with Russia is somewhat tenuous, but more of an ally.
Well, I don't think, I personally am rather critical of the way we treated Russia. When Russia descended into really quite serious weakness in the 1990s and beyond, we decided rather than welcoming Russia to to the free world, as we like to speak of it. We decided to push them rather hard, and we ran the boundaries of NATO right up against the Russian Empire. And I think if we'd been a little more sympathetic to the Russians and treated them with a little more generosity and given them a little more assistance, relations might be better today now that they're recovering some small portion of their former strength. I do not think that Russians are a military, physical threat to Europe in any sense today.
You've allowed us to hold a mirror up to your life and therefore the events that we also experienced. I'm wondering if you want to say anything about marriage and the need that there may be for a marriage 101, 103, 107 somehow.
Oh, if you could only learn about marriage in universities or graduate programs or advanced graduate programs, I think it would be of enormous benefit. But I'm afraid that the only way you learn about marriage is by doing it. And I knew theoretically what I believed on a number of issues before beginning to enter into a marriage and a family. But I discovered that my theoretical knowledge, I'm tempted to a pithy obscenity here, which I will not use on the air, it was not worth much, let's say. So I think, in the words of the jazz musician, you just got to do it, man.
Pretty good advice. And maybe that's true of protesting, or maybe that's true of rereading history and trying to understand how it affects us. I, for one, believe that we need to read Roman history to understand what's happening today in the U.S. But anyway, I want to thank you for being here. I encourage anyone to read Tom's book, Abbott, Gleason, Liberal Education. I also encourage us all to look heartily at our own lives and begin to journal and to write our own reflections and to see how we became sort of the moral agents that we are now as adults. But thank you very much for your honesty and for this very interesting and honestly fun book. So
you're most welcome. Please, ladies and gentlemen, do buy it.
Thank you for watching Good News RI. This is the end of this show, and we hope that you will tell your friends about this show and that you will continue to watch us 3 times a week. Good News is right around the corner, and you will probably help to make it. Thank you.